So, why do you think calorie restriction diets in a lot of cases don't work long term?
Because they're restricting too low. That's the reason. Because whenever I see people and they come in and they say they've already tried to lose weight and it's just not working, they're usually following a 1200 calorie diet.
Yes, yes.
And a lot of times they're using MyFitnessPal, and that can be a great tool for the right person, but each person is so different in what will work for them. I can have one person do a MyFitnessPal type food tracking and it works great. Another person becomes totally obsessive about it and it becomes like just something running their life. And so you don't know what will work for each person. And the 1200 calories, I always tell people that is the amount that a toddler eats. That's the amount that we need to feed a toddler and help them grow. And so a full size adult, that's not going to work for them. I've even had grown men come into my office, 6 foot something, and they're trying to do 800 calories. And that is just not going to work. And so you're putting your body in a starvation mode. And so now the body is saying, okay, we're in a famine, because historically that's how God created us to be, is we're really resilient and our bodies are always trying to keep us alive. That's the whole purpose of our metabolism. And so if you put yourself in that starvation mode, your body is then going to say, okay, we don't know when there's going to be food again, because this famine could last for a while and we need to stay alive. So it's going to mess things up and it's going to make it harder once you do start eating again, because your body's like, oh, now we have food. So we might be in a famine again. And, no fancy terms there as far as like metabolism, but that's just, it doesn't work well. And so I think it also sets people up for excessive eating, because if you're extremely hungry, you may jump to the other side of the spectrum and get extremely full.
Yes.
And I see that all the time with people that skip breakfast or skip lots and lots of meals, or they may skip days of eating, and then they end up in a binge. And so the reason is that you're just restricting. So I always tell people restriction often leads to binge eating.
Yeah, and we see the exact same thing that you just described with like the under eating and the culture and the books and all this, over the years has told us like, eat less and lose weight, be fit, and you are so right. Like the metabolism dies out, right? It gets so slow because the body thinks we're in famine mode. It's like we're starving. So we have to, retain everything. The next meal that we eat, we have to retain that as energy, as fat, right? And that's why people eating this 800 to 1200 calories a day in many cases can't lose weight. And so when they, realize they can eat more food and lose weight and feel better, they're like, holy cow, this is great. Yeah, that's it's interesting to see the same thing. It's too bad. So people listening, go and eat more good food. You probably feel a hell of a lot better. So what is I read on your website, I don't know if you coined this term or something that you use within your practice, but intuitive eating, what is that?
Intuitive eating is a 10, I don't know, I wouldn't say 10 step, but it's 10 ideas that were made by 2 dietitians in the 90s. And they started working, actually, Evelyn Tribal was one of the original dietitians. I honestly can't remember the name of the other one, but Evelyn Tribal is the one that I'm doing some training with now. And she was working, like the full story, she was working with celebrities in Hollywood, and she was doing an approach that was working really well for them. So she was encouraging them to eat their meals, because I think in Hollywood, you're going to see these diet cultures on steroids, because they're all trying to be looking perfect out there, right? So she started working out there as a registered dietitian, which registered dietitians, just to kind of promote my field, we've done 4 years of an undergraduate bachelor's degree, which is honestly, I think, one of the hardest. It is a very difficult degree. A lot of my training was very similar to the pre-med students. Like, we were taking a lot of the same classes, organic chemistry, biochemistry, like it's very science heavy. But then we also take a lot of culinary classes. So we take, 3 levels of like foods classes, and we have a whole bunch of food service management that we do because we're trained to be food service managers in clinical facilities, hospitals. So anyways, we do 4 years of undergraduate, and then we do a 1,200-hour clinical rotation.
Wow.
So that we can get training in the hospital. So we're trained to be the clinical manager for the food service of the hospital. That's one thing that we could do with our degree, but we could also be a clinical dietitian, which I worked doing that for a while. So I would work weekends at Bassett Hospital, and I would do coverage for vacations and stuff. And I still work clinical, but there we do things like go see a person in the hospital, assess their nutritional status, like understand all of their medical conditions. Like, we understand if they have kidney disease, what does that mean as far as their protein intake? And post-surgical patients, we see patients in the intensive care unit that need to be on a tube feeding, that are ventilated. I'm sure that there were lots of dietitians that their role really stepped up during COVID as far as doing that. So we're really well-rounded, and it's a really advanced training, and now they require a master's degree. So that's our background. But anyways, that's totally digressing from your question. I'm just telling you that to let you know that Evelyn Tribal had that same training that I have. And so she was working with these celebrities. It wasn't just some diet-based thing. And she was finding that the information that she was giving was actually working really well. So she put it into this system called intuitive eating. And there's workbooks out there, and there's also a book called Intuitive Eating. So, and what they focus on is rejecting the dieting mentality, making peace with food, honoring your hunger, feeling your fullness, and movement for the joy of movement, and gentle nutrition. Which means that we do the basics of healthy eating based on the USDA dietary guidelines for Americans, which they put out every, I think it's every 10 years. They just got a new one recently. And so it's just basic healthy eating. We're not doing any crazy diet trends. So when you feel your fullness, you stop eating when you're full. When you eat when you're actually hungry, you don't get excessively hungry, because excessive hunger often leads to excessive fullness because you'll overdo it. And I always tell my clients, if you're excessively hungry, you're in that primal hunger zone, meaning your body's like, let's just get some food, no matter what it is. If it's a candy bar, I'm grabbing it. If it's this, I'm grabbing it. So the whole premise is it's not like a physical way to eat, because a lot of people think that it is. It's those 10 principles. And I know I only gave you 7, so I missed a few.
It's okay.
But if you go to my website, you'll be able to click on the hyperlink in my about page, and it leads you right to the intuitive eating webpage, so you can learn all about it. And this has, so Evelyn Tribal started doing this with the stars, and they started being really successful with it. And then what happened is they started doing research on it. And so the basis of care that every registered dietitian is supposed to be providing based on our code of ethics has to be research-based. And so intuitive eating is not just some trend which it is a trend right now. It's becoming very popular, but it's not just like a trend. There's a lot of research behind it. And the research was done with large groups of people, and they found that over time, when they did this method where they stopped doing their chronic dieting and they started actually eating in a basic healthy eating pattern, people actually had more success long-term. So I use intuitive eating right off the bat for my clients that have a history of chronic dieting. I'll also use it for people that have medical conditions, because I may get someone that comes into my office and they do have diabetes, but the reason they have diabetes is because they were chronic dieting for their whole life and now they're in their 60s. And I hate to say that, but that is often the end stage of chronic dieting that nobody really talks about, is chronic medical conditions, because of the rebound weight gain that people get after, and the way that they're eating large amounts of things like carbs at one time, which makes their blood sugar go all over the place. I see so many people with diabetes, especially women in their late 50s and 60s, because they grew up with the Twiggy generation.
Yeah.
And so they felt like they needed to be that thin. And if they weren't that thin, they were not beautiful. And so for their generation, a lot of people in my parents' generation, a lot of those women, they did the chronic diets because back then that's all they had. They didn't have a lot of dietitians stepping out and providing great resources and education, and intuitive eating wasn't developed. And so a lot of women, unfortunately, were on these chronic diets. And that now some of them are suffering from the medical conditions like high cholesterol, which can lead to heart disease, diabetes, pre-diabetes, which is, before you actually get diabetes. And so I do love working with those women, because not only do I get to help them manage their condition and get their blood sugars into the right range and get their cholesterol managed and move just for the joy of movement, but I also really do end up talking to them a lot about what does it mean to feel like you have to be that thin, and why are we now allowed to reject that idea and embrace who you are and what you look like right now.
I love that. Yeah, that's a great base level for so many people that are so hard on themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's probably a huge relief. One thing I'm interested in is when we look at someone with a metabolic syndrome, let's say, or prediabetes and whatnot, their metabolism is off, could have a whole host of other health issues. Intuitive eating, so eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full, I'd be curious to see the choices that they're making, right? Because, and I'm just generalizing, because for me, if I intuitively ate all the time anything I wanted, right? So now we're talking about quality. That could be really bad for me, only because I would eat way more sugar and more maybe refined carbs or whatnot. And so how do you approach the difference? And I do believe in the method in terms of, what you're stating with intuitive eating, but how do you teach and educate people on the quality that they should be putting in there at the same time, or don't you to start with because it's too much?
No, I do. And I
Okay.
usually, so the last principle of intuitive eating is called gentle nutrition. So here's where you cannot do, and this is where some people feel like, well, this doesn't work. You have to have all of these ideas and principles together. You can't take one out of context. So gentle nutrition means that we are having all of the food groups. And this is where I'll often do a structured meal plan. So I do a lot of meal planning in my practice, and I don't do it outside of the appointments at all. First of all, because I don't really like doing it, to be honest with you. If I were to have to outside of being with a person do that, I would just go crazy because it's not fun to me. But I will teach my clients the skill so they can do it on their own. And I do a lot of meal planning with them. Okay, so what are you going to have for your meals this week? And we're basing that on the dietary guidelines for Americans. So if you go ahead and Google the dietary guidelines for Americans, you're going to see that there is a set research-based way that we are recommended to be eating for general health. And then what I'll do with people that have diabetes and other chronic conditions is what's called medical nutrition therapy. And so medical nutrition therapy is not something you hear out there very often, but that is the research-based approach that I'll take. So for one person, I may say, okay, we need more protein in your diet because we need to increase this for your appetite and for your fullness. For another person that may have a late stage kidney disease, I'm actually restricting protein because it's going to affect them. And so that's where only a registered dietitian knows the difference between that and like which person should be on what therapeutic meal plan. And so the therapeutic meal plan goes hand in hand with the intuitive eating. And for people that just have, general healthy diet that I'm focusing on, sometimes I'll just use the My Plate method. I don't know if you've ever seen My Plate.
I have, yeah.
Okay. I know that you guys have kids, right?
Yeah, we have one, yes.
Okay. So then if they're in school, I don't know how old they are, like in
third grade.
Okay. So then in the cafeteria, they should have posters of the My Plate. It's actually one of the school lunch program protocols and one of the things they do, because I did a school lunch rotation when I did my clinical hours for being a dietitian. So they have posters out, and that is apparently their idea of providing nutrition education to kids, the posters in the lunchroom, which personally, I think they should have a K through 12 nutrition education because it's so important and it's causing so many health issues with people in our country. But anyway, that's just my opinion. So I may just use that My Plate method with people for meal planning, because maybe knowing exactly how many starches and proteins and carbs and fats at each meal is just too much. So I may just say, okay, when you look at your plate, split it down the middle. Now let's split it across. I want half your plate to be fruits and vegetables. A quarter should be at least 3 to 5 ounces of protein. And then I want a fist size worth of starches, which is 1 cup. And if I do that, I'm doing pretty good with someone to get them to portion control and to just eat a basic healthy meal plan. But as they're eating that well-portioned meal, they may get full, and then they need to know, like, okay, I don't have to eat everything on my plate. And that's where they can use that intuitive eating.